WorldRider, the podcast edition. Podcasting. Who would have ever thought?
Hi, welcome. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm Allan Karl WorldRider, your host of the Journeys with WorldRider Podcast. I am so excited, as I always am, with guests that are far more interesting than anything I've ever done with today. And today, a real special guest, a award-winning travel writer, travel author, travel journalist, and we're going to talk all about that stuff. His name is Tom Miller, and you've probably heard of him or at least heard about some of his books. You know, since 1969, Tom, from Washington, D.C. originally, he's lived in Arizona, where he wrote for the underground anti-war press, then for sea-level publications such as the Smithsonian and, Rolling Stone, Esquire, the Chicago Quarterly Review, the New Yorker, Life, and so many others. Some that you've probably never heard of, but had a big impact, by the way, during the 1960s, early 70s. His books, which he's most famous for, of course, include the Panama Hat Trail, which was about obviously about the Panama Hat in South America. And you're going to know that it was South America, not Central America, where these hats came from. He wrote On the Border, an account of his travels along the U.S.-Mexico frontier. Revenge of the Saguaro, that legendary cactus about the American Southwest. And about Cuba, traveling with the enemy. He has been a member of the Thornton Wilder Society and the Cervantes Society of America, and served as a fellow of the Gilder Lehrman Institute for American History. And by the way, the city of Quito in Ecuador, the capital, right there on the equator, designated Miller, my guest today, un huésped ilustre. Now, I don't know how my Spanish accent's working today, but an illustrious guest, I think that's what that stands for. And he was honored by the Castillo-La Mancha Regional Consejera de Cultura, Turismo y Artesanía in Spain. And in 2017, he was honored with a Fescript. And since 1990, he has served as an adjunct research associate for the Center of Latin American Studies at the University of Arizona down there in Tucson, which, by the way, where my brother went. He can be seen, reached, and learn much more at tommillerbooks.com, his website. One thing that the formal bio doesn't say, that in order to really be a good travel writer, not only do you have to get all this recognition and write for these big names, but I think it really helps build the character if you have an opportunity to work on an ice cream truck maybe, or to sell Encyclopedia Britannia door to door, or maybe even work as a janitor in a slaughterhouse. Welcome, my guest, Tom Miller.
Well,
hey, man.
you.
I don't know how my pronunciation a little bit shaky there, but
No,
wow.
but Alan, your English is very good.
Well, there you go. Great. Buenísimo.
Buenísimo.
So, welcome to the podcast. Before we, get into everything here, I tell you what, I finished about a week ago. Where Was I? A travel writer's memoir, Tom Miller. And, it's funny because just today, as I was warming up for the podcast, I got an email from the Publishers Weekly, because I write too, and I get these things randomly, and I don't usually look at them. But this one today was about the famous writer. Is it James Patterson? Is that, he's a fiction writer.
Correct.
But he just released a memoir. And the blurb about it said that this is perhaps the best work he's ever done. And I'm wondering, there's so much honesty and so much deep into what your life was like as you were writing these award-winning pieces and books. How did it feel writing this memoir?
I got to a point where I could not continue to write for practical reasons because I was physically unable to do so. So instead of looking forward, I looked backward. And when I looked backward, there was some continuity there, something I could tie all these stories together and have someone find, as you did, find some continuity, find some works that fit one into the other. They lock into place, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, absolutely. There is a flow, and I love the way that you put that. Instead of looking forward, that looking backward, and then finding the pieces of the puzzle, as the adage would go, to
Yes.
see how they all connect each other. Yeah, you have you say that you don't have the ability to write like you used to, which of course is you're not able to travel like you used to. And I know you begin your book with your struggle of Parkinson's and what your life is like. And of course, we close the book a little bit with that. So the bookends of that are Parkinson's. And I thought we should just, let the cat out of the bag, as it were, and just, tell our listeners a little bit about that. I mean, it's 49 pills a day or something.
Too many. I've stopped counting.
Yeah, it's one of those. And for those on the podcast probably don't know, but my stepfather suffered from Parkinson's, and I know one of the things about him. He's also a writer, and one of the most frustrating aspects are that. And your voice still seems strong, but as he progressed, his voice got really low. And when you get into a room with several people talking, he always would be a bit of a dominator in the conversation, and his voice couldn't project above the noise. And in many ways, he felt like he wasn't part of that conversation. What's it like for you now with Parkinson's?
Well, I'll tell you, I was first diagnosed with it in the year 2008. And for a good while, it bothered me, but only mildly, tremors and such. Anyway, I'm glad you mentioned the voice. My voice has always been strong, and I've occasionally used the microphone at events. But I will tell you that just within the last 8 or 10 weeks, it's gotten somewhat grainy. I don't know if that comes across or if that makes any sense. But my voice has become somewhat grainy, as opposed to like this, where I really have to try hard to get this. But in conversation, it's something, frankly, I don't like it a lot, but there's not a whole lot I can do about it. Here in Tucson, Arizona, there is a gymnasium which is established exclusively for people with Parkinson's. And I go there 3 times a week, and you cannot recover from Parkinson's, but you can slow down the getting worse. And that's what I do at this gym. I slow down the getting worse. We have exercises, we have one-on-ones, we have, you can even talk about it philosophically if you want. But it's a gymnasium that is strictly for people with Parkinson's.
Oh, interesting. So it's a peer group that you can all share your.
Yes.
Yeah, that's very good. Parkinson's, I got to tell you that it is a horrific disease, and as you said, it's not something that you can cure. You can only slow, and there are many people out there suffering from it. And it's just one of those things that I hope that, we say modern science, we made a vaccine for this crazy virus in so fast as that science is able to, do more for this in the future. But
now I've had this now for close to 14 years. And well, my age, let's say I'm 2 trombones short of the Music Man.
Well, that's, yeah, let's just well, I know that it gets tougher and tougher to write, but this memoir, Where Was I? A travel writer's memoir, is just fantastic. And one of the things, there's 2 points I wanted to ask you about as I read this, because right at the beginning you talk about what is the distinguished difference, if all, between a journalist, because you started as well, let's just face it, but you bring this point up, as a journalist and a travel writer.
That's correct. Journalist, underground press. You were mentioning the different publications and their influence. You left out the Berkeley Barb.
Oh, the Berkeley Barb, right.
Right. Which at the time was really, I think it was 25 cents if you could find somebody on a street corner in Berkeley. on Telegraph Avenue. But it was a paper strictly of the left, culturally, politically, musically. Show people your Jerry Garcia cap.
Yes. No, okay.
There you are.
I'm honoring Jerry. He's the iconic missing finger, you know. But yes, that's Berkeley, Haight-Ashbury, the glory days, right?
I would say so, yes.
Yeah. In the book, you write, you know, coming back to my notes, that's one thing I found. As a writer, you, in your book, many times talk about, I wouldn't call it an obsession, but a discipline to be always taking notes. Constantly.
I know it's constant because I can remember the one time I decided not to take notes. I was so enwrapped. I was so remarkable reaction to an event I was at. I stopped taking notes and just sat back and passed a joint and just enjoyed the rest of it.
Uh-huh. You know, and I'm going to probably pull this up. So in the book, you talk about travel writers, and when I was mentioning journalists and travel writers, you make a point of saying that there really is no line between those, because a travel writer is in a sense reporting. It just is different, and certainly, you know, when you're taking notes and passing the joint back and forth, you know, you tend to create pictures in your brain of what's going on, and the notes help you eventually recreate that. But in the book, and it's on page 77, I'm going to open that up again. You have a little distrust of some travel writers' descriptions. I mean, it just brought a smile to my face. Since then, I've learned this much. Great travel writing describes what's going on when nobody's looking. It consists of equal parts curiosity, vulnerability, and vocabulary. It is not a terrain for know-it-alls or the indecisive. The best of the field can simply be an elegant natural history essay, a nicely writ sports piece, or a well-turned profile of a bar band and its music. A well-grounded sense of place is the challenge for the writer. We observe, we calculate, we inquire, we look for a link between what we already know and what we're about to learn. And then you talk in there about people that you know use things like nestled and things. So what does make a travel writer versus somebody who's really writing a marketing piece?
Well, one of the lines you read earlier, that it covers what's going on when nobody's looking. It's a sense of, as I said, a sense of vulnerability, something that you don't quite know what the next step is. You know what the last step was. You don't know what the next one is, but you're ready to write about it.
and I like that you blend with what you know with what you're about to learn.
Yes.
And you had an interesting dinner and I forget exactly where that was. It may have been in Mexico, but it was with the CIA, somebody from the CIA, and somebody with the KGB.
Oh yeah.
And I think you know. So you've got a Russian spy, and you've got a CIA spy, but there you are somehow with this in this weird situation, which is what you know and what you're about to learn. But you order a drink and you order a White Russian. I just think this is so classic. And I wanted to see if you wouldn't mind telling our audience a little bit about how that came about and what you felt afterwards.
This was in this is mid or late 70s, and I'd been attending a intensive Spanish language school in Cuernavaca, which is south of Mexico City. But I finished that fairly successfully, and I was in Mexico City meeting up with the U.S. Embassy. Would have a sort of a low-level, junior-level bureaucrat, diplomat, and his role was simply to take charge of anything having to do with the Mexican border. In those days, Mexican border meant nothing to anybody, not even Mexico. But this fellow invited me to be on a panel about the border, and also sitting in the audience was I can't even remember the name of it, a Russian newspaper had a reporter there. Well, Russia did not in those days, and probably not in these days, have a reporter sitting in somewhere without staying in close touch with the intelligentsia. And so the four of us, there was a wife involved too, the four of us went out to a restaurant in the Zona Rosa of Mexico City. And I realized here I am with the KGB. He doesn't say KGB on his name tag, but you know he does. And the CIA, and this guy, the CIA guy who was actually from the U.S. Embassy, we drove in his staff car down to the basement of the embassy, and the Russian guy was just going crazy. He was writing down all the license plate numbers he could come up with, because the U.S. diplomat it was not his role really it was not his role to show people the basement of the U.S. Embassy, but sure enough, we had it there. We went to this restaurant, and I realized, as you described, I had a white Russian.
It's just those little details that come out in your book are fascinating. I'll
tell you this. I would while we were having dinner, about every 5 minutes, I would get up and run off to the bathroom and write down my notes, because I didn't want to write down notes in front of everybody in a situation like that. But I would always run back with pencil and paper and come back and say, "Okay, continue, please."
It is a huge discipline and a practice, the note taking, for sure. I find that I probably don't do a lot. Sometimes I'll use my camera, because I'm always with a camera, and not just, nowadays everybody's got a camera with a phone, but even in the old days, I'd use my camera more sometimes as a notebook to keep the visual thing. Speaking of the border, and you've spent, in fact, I would call you probably obsessed with the border, because it kept calling you back, the Mexico and U.S. border, which of course in the last 5 years has gained, even more attention. But you write that this is a 2,000-mile long third country sandwiched between two larger ones.
That's
and I'd love for you to give us a sense of why you feel that and what you see there.
Well, there are the qualities of one country, the qualities of the other. They overlap somewhat, and the closer you get to the physical political line, the stronger the overlap. So you can have, it's a third country which has its own laws, its own outlaws, its own music, its own literature. It has its own customs. It has its own culture. That's really what it comes down to, their own culture. And the line between the two countries is simply arbitrary. As you say, it's a third country, and this third country is 2,000 miles long and no more than 20 miles wide.
No more than 25 miles wide. Yeah,
right.
It's interesting. And you're there in the Tucson area, pretty close to the border there. And you talk about an event that went on for several years between the people in this third country that straddle that border, but with there being a large fence there was a volleyball tournament, right? Tell us about that.
Yes, there was. A simple volleyball game, nothing profound about it, but on one side were all the mayors and bureaucrats from the Mexico towns along the border, and on the U.S. side were all the mayors and bureaucrats on the U.S. side of the border. They use a regular conventional volleyball, but instead of a net, they use the Mexican U.S.-Mexico fence. So when you hit the ball over, you hit it from one country to the other. You'd slam the ball from one country to another. You'd serve it from one country to the other. It was a volleyball game, an international volleyball game.
And literally a border crossing game.
Yes, it was. Yes, it was.
Huh.
Off in the distance, you could see the Border Patrol simply watching, making sure there was nothing too untoward. They didn't want to interrupt the game and make things a little more uncomfortable. So people just stood and watched, and we had grandstands on both sides.
Interesting. Yeah. Wow. There's so many places, so many questions I want to ask you, but I want to come back to the CIA because you also had a meeting back in D.C. early in your career, and actually had a job offer. And I would love for you to share that story. Now, of course, all of these stories are dig deep into your book, so people need to go out. And I'll put links, by the way, to where you can buy Tom's book and on Amazon and the other usual suspects. But yeah, that job offer and that potential assignment. Tell us about it.
What happened was I was working for something called College Press Service. We had about 500 subscribing newspapers from all over the country, and people who were interested in what was going on would call up and say, what is it with the kids these days? What is it they want? Well, there was one guy who was particularly keen on talking to me, so he invited me to a meal with him, and I think it was just the two of us. But he made an offer, which later I found out was a perfect offer of recruitment for the CIA. He said, well, you can travel in Latin America, and we want you to write stories about the people you run into and the politics you run into. Oh, yeah, you could publish them anywhere, just so you publish them with us. Oh, yes, we'd be happy to have you do it for us. You want to visit your brother in Brazil who was in the Peace Corps at the time? Sure, we could get you down there just so you write stories for us. And on he would make these offers, generous offers, on the table. He did everything but use the letter CIA. And I said, well, no, that's very nice. I'll call you back later this week. Well, I called back later this week, and the African art gallery that he claimed he represented didn't exist then. So it was a phony offer from the very beginning. But again, I imagine there are people who would have accepted that offer too.
Sure. I mean, that's like a free trip to visit your brother and whatever else, candy he throwed along the way. Why not? Yes. But you had, you had the journalist's eye. You needed to do your research and find out what maybe that was too good to be true. So, you have so many run-ins. There was and we'll get into that, the anti-war, because you were really deep into that, especially during that period with CPS and in the underground newspapers. There was this another colorful character in your book who I think you might have called Mr. Big, and I think he was in Chihuahua. And you say that he, and I don't recall the exact thing, so you can fill me in and remind me, but I do remember you saying something that this guy, maybe he really wanted you to be, you're Boswell. And I love the way that you characterize some of these, characters. Tell us about Mr. Big.
Mr. Big. There's a Mr. Big in those days in practically every town. Mr. Big was a dope dealer. No hard drugs, just basic soft marijuana. And Mr. Big would be the major, what's a good word for it? You're the writer here. Mr. Big, what was that?
The kingpin, maybe.
Okay, all right. We'll make him the kingpin of the neighborhood. And he had a number of people who worked for him. He had, but what he really wanted more than anything else was to be famous. He didn't want his name used. It was just Mr. Big. But for his fame, he invited me down to the city of Chihuahua from the city of Tucson, and spent better part of a day with me. And what he wanted me to move into a house he would have furnished for me. I don't know if I mentioned this in the book, but he had a woman waiting for me as well. It's all part of the Mr. Big influence, I would say, in most cities. He wanted somebody to write a book about him. He wanted to be known but unknown, and I got him as far as the unknown, but I just didn't want to do the known with him. It just didn't seem right. It was like the CIA fellow in Mexico City. It just didn't seem right. Like the CIA recruiter in Washington DC. It just didn't seem right. But it made for a great story.
Yeah, exactly. That's the way we always look at things at the end. You had a number of these. I will say that as I read through the book, and people will have to see this, is that there are so many unwritten books that you have, that are in your head that are still lingering. Whether it's the revolutionary from Cuba, I forget Martis, I forget his name, and then of course Jose Marti, yeah, and then certainly Don Quixote, Cervantes, and onward. So these are just some of those, but yeah, you have so many people that come drift in and out of your orbit during your career as a writer that, to me, every time I'm like, first of all, you saw the Doors live. I mean, I was a little too late for, a little too late for that, but that would be.
It was at an auditorium called the Crosstown Bus in Cambridge. And no, it was in Boston. I was living in Boston at the time, just for a few months.
Wow. And then, of course, we see it's funny. You get, there's Bruce Springsteen and Commander Cody. You're Jerry Rubin. You've got, of course, is it Jan Weber? Jan Winner from. That was kind of fun for me. It's like there was a point in your career as a writer, as we writers, we don't have a paycheck that comes day to day. No. And I thought that there was a realization you came to at some point in your career after having a phone call with the founder of Rolling Stone. Tell us about that day to day. Where does the money come from? Work as a writer.
That's what I like about your podcast. There's a certain level of informality which your listeners appreciate, and your guests certainly do too.
This is more like a conversation over a cup of coffee or a glass of wine. That's.
I would say.
Yep.
In fact, speaking of that, I have a coffee mug. I don't have it with me at this moment, but it says "We'll write for food."
Okay, there you go. Mine says, this was a gift from a friend of mine. I'm a big. I love wine, so this is called breakfast wine. If you see that.
You got it right. There's a point where you're doing freelance writing and you have a level of success, but the success might be appreciation rather than funds. And while occasionally I would have somebody in the family slip me something, I'd find that the more flexible publications were always the publications that paid the least. So I try to get a little of this, a little of that. I read Smithsonian one day, and a few days later, piece for Rolling Stone. It was not easy. If you look at it strictly as a financial investment, I would say find a wealthy spouse.
This is good. Yeah, you mentioned in there that for some time Rolling Stone would paid you a retainer, but then at some point they weren't quite underground for sure, but they may have had their roots in some underground. But in that business, in that writing business, you talk about somebody who was, I think, quite remarkable in how much time he spent honoring you, to be honest, was Harvey Ginsberg. And Harvey Ginsberg, for those of you listening, was a agent or editor for, what was his role again?
He was an editor.
Okay, editor for which publishing house? He went to. I know he went to a new one in the middle of your career.
Yeah, my relationship with him started at Harper and Row, which is now called HarperCollins, and at some point Harper and Row, they didn't fire him, but they pretty much eliminated his acquisitions budget, which is a way of firing an editor. And so he went over to William Morrow, and he worked out his career at William Morrow.
You talk about that, and maybe you want to frame that for us. That you pitched a book to them, and you eventually deliver the manuscript. And what happens?
What happens is Harvey Ginsberg invites me. I was coming in from Arizona to New York 2 or 3 weeks ahead of time, I make arrangements to meet with him. And my figuring was, okay, he'll invite me to lunch. We'll have a good time. We'll have a drink. We'll toast to the success of this new book. But I really didn't notice the time he suggested for our appointment was 2 p.m. That's after the lunch hour, even in New York. So I walk into his office. I notice there's a whip on the screen, on the wall behind him. He says, have a seat. I have a seat. And there on his desk is my manuscript, the one that I had mailed to him about 2 or 3 weeks earlier. And he taps it and says, and I say that I presume this is my manuscript. He says, yes. What you have sent me, Mr. Miller, is 16 excellent magazine pieces. I want you to go home and write a book. And then for the next 3 hours, he wouldn't take any calls except someone else in his office. For the next 3 hours, he taught me how to write a book. Advice on speed, on declarations, advice on how to use fictional quality, use non-fictional quality. It was pretty much the entire A to Z of writing a book. I never took a course in literature. I never took a course in journalism. But I will say that the 3 hours I spent with Harvey Ginsberg that afternoon in 1979, I think it was, somewhere in there, was the best education I could have ever had.
To think of that, I can't imagine that happening in today's environment with so many people either self-interested in, their social media, and that it's a different world. So I'd say we'll toast our coffee to Harvey Ginsberg. With maybe without that 3-hour meeting, we wouldn't have had the Panama Hat Trail, which is a good segue, I think, into that. So Panama hats, Panama City, right? The country.
I think you're a little bit off. Panama hats, they are hats, but they're not Panama.
That's right. Yep. Keep going.
Fact, I wanted to write a book about Panama hats. I wanted to write a book about the making and marketing of Panama hats. So, of course, I would go to Panama, wouldn't I? No, I wouldn't. I would go to Ecuador, which is where Panama hats come from.
Yes, that's right. So if you want a Panama hat, to go to the origin, you go to
Ecuador, where the raw straw is harvested out in the lowlands, and it goes through a whole series of processes in different factories in Ecuador. Finally, it gets on an airplane and goes to the States, goes to another factory or two, and finally ends up on a hat shop. The one I followed ended up in downtown San Diego, but almost every town has a shop that will sell good quality Panamas. Now, there are imitation Panamas that are made in China, and frankly, they do look good. But I say this, accept no substitutes.
Accept no substitutes. And how many Panama hats do you have?
Am I going to, as soon as I got them, I would give them away. I have 3 myself right now.
Okay.
But that may change within the next 4 weeks. Who knows?
You may have a visit.
I did some research, and I wrote up a book proposal. I sent it to this editor, Harvey Ginsberg, at William Morrow and Company. He said, nah, this really doesn't work for me. Thank you anyway. So I did what I should have done to begin with. I went back to Ecuador, took loads of notes, loads and pages of notes that are now on file at the University of Arizona Library, in fact. And the notes turned into a book proposal. I went back to Harvey and said, oh, this is what you had in mind. Sure, we'll take it on. So Harvey became my editor, first at Harper & Row and secondly at William Morrow. I appreciated both places.
And for those of listeners who may be fans of yours, seeing that you've been your interview on the podcast, will know of that book. But I have not yet read it, but I will. But what you shared about it in Where Was I is that the Panama Hat Trail is, as you said, you follow the manufacture of a hat from Ecuador to San Diego, and in great detail of the labor involved, how much the native Ecuadorians, from the growers to the treaters, how much they make, how much that hat really costs, to about how much it ends up in the shelf of a San Diego boutique. It's a fascinating story. So it's the Panama Hat Trail by Tom Miller.
The hat becomes a device, a literary device to write about life in South America. And I think I covered it adequately. I was very satisfied with what happened. There's one word that I didn't use, and yet it describes the entire book in one word: exploitation. If I put that in there, nobody would pick up the book. That's a terrible word to use when you're trying to induce a reader. But that's essentially what the making and marketing of a Panama hat consists of: exploitation.
Yeah, that's a good point, and it's a word that you avoided there, but it's certainly what you come away with after you read this book. And
it's the subtext. That's what it is. It's the subtext of the story.
Yeah, you there's so many things, so many characters, as I say, that weave in and out of your life. And there was a mercenary named John Dane. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. John Dane. And you ended up having a pretty good gig for a little bit of time for 60 Minutes. I'd love for you to share that story, because there's two elements of that story, of course, but John Dane in 60 Minutes. John Dane was the real thing. There were a lot of imitation mercenaries. They subscribed to Soldier of Fortune magazine. They were Vietnam vets, but they didn't have the real stuff of a real mercenary. John Dane did. Who knows what his real name was? It certainly wasn't John Dane, and his next name was Paul Dubois. That's the next passport he used. But he could use fake passports. He used fake identity. He became a U.S. soldier, so he would become a U.S. citizen. He enlisted in the war against Vietnam, and he then had a U.S. citizenship. And with the U.S. citizenship, he was able to get access to weapons from a National Guard armory in Utah, I believe it was. He was eventually popped. He was arrested for all this. And I sensed the story there. I just saw there's a real story with this guy. So I talked to him more and more. Turns out he was involved with an assassination plot to kill Yasser Arafat of the PLO. We never got near that, but the people who wanted to hire him did not know that he was tape recording their conversation with him. So he let me listen to this tape. This topic of mercenaries was very hot these days. Again, we're talking mid-1970s. Mm-hmm. And Rolling Stone wanted a story on mercenaries. 60 Minutes wanted a story on mercenaries. And I told one, I'm going to be working for somebody else. They said, that's okay. You work for us, you work for anybody you want. So I ended up working for 60 Minutes. They flew him in from Salisbury, Rhodesia, a country that no longer exists. But they flew him from Salisbury, Rhodesia to Mazatlan, where he was going to prove his bona fide as a marksman. He didn't want to go back to the United States. It just was too much trouble for him. Mm. So I was able to parlay one story into the other and satisfied myself with both.
Yeah, and then the that part of that story, I think, is interesting, is how 60 Minutes could not obviously.
Oh, yes, of course.
Yeah,
I almost forgot about that. Thank you for reminding me. 60 Minutes had to get John Dane from Rhodesia to Mexico. Well, because of the situation and the circumstance, they simply couldn't just give him an airline ticket that said, John Dane, have a nice day. What they did was bought two negotiable airline tickets, first class, from Rhodesia to Mazatlan for himself and Mrs. Dane. Well, there was no Mrs. Dane. In fact, there was no John Dane. Everything in his ticket was phony, but he was able to cash in these tickets. They were negotiable, as I said, and they would be able to, in this sense, 60 Minutes was able to pay him without really paying him. It's one of those stories that Dan Rather likes to tell, I believe. Dan Rather was the correspondent on this particular story. And later on, after the story aired, he said, well, if you want to, you can tell people how this came about, but we'll take a hit, but we'd survive.
Yeah. It's fascinating. And you wrote in the book that until this book came out, you'd never shared that detail with anyone.
That's true. It's the first time it's been public. It was in this book.
Yeah. So, it begs to wonder the creativity of some people to get around certain rules or norms, right? Yes.
Yes.
There's I'd like to talk a little bit, and I guess it's two things there, and is actually, let me excuse me. Okay, we can edit that cough out, please. The pistol packing priest or evangelical. I mean, this in Nigeria, this is also another one of those jaw-dropping kind of encounters. Share with our listeners that episode.
He's no longer there, but there was a man who was the priest into that. And he was in charge of the Catholic mission for Berlin and West Africa, meaning including Nigeria. His opponents were the evangelicals, and they had an office and a dormitory practically next door to him in the town of Lagos, Nigeria. They would be attacking him. He would be attacking them. There was a lot of battles going on. This particular priest was wonderful. He had 3 wall safes. So why do you have 3 wall safes? Well, he said, well, I'll tell you, if they come and rob me, there's always money left over.
They only find one safe.
Exactly. He would purchase weapons for himself and for some of the priests. I got to know him well enough, but not well enough to write a book about him. And I've always regretted that I didn't have the opportunity to sit down with him and perhaps move into the Jesuit. That's the word I'm looking for.
Jesuits. Ah, that's right.
How can I forget the Jesuits?
Yeah, yes.
Yeah. So he would. I'm sure he would have let me move into a Jesuit dormitory for a number of months to get a good book going, but my circumstance simply didn't allow for that. So I missed that, but it's a good example of the stories that you miss.
Yeah, you spent quite a bit of time in Spain. You were looking. You had a story, a book idea regarding Quixote, and it's an incredible where you meet this multimillionaire who has this incredible library. I'm struggling here because there's so much elements to the story, including John Lee. Was it John Lee?
John Lee Anderson.
Yeah. I have to say I smiled and laughed when he was open to looking at some of your work, your writing, and you ask him. He says, you say to him, "Okay, well, here, give me your fax number. I'll fax you something." And how does he reply to that?
Miller, fax. What century are you in?
Exactly, because was that in the early 2000s? Was that?
Yes.
Yeah. That's a good point. So over your long life, from covering the underground newspapers, not just covering them, but representing them, to covering the war, protests, all the way to we could say it's kind of trendy now, and to border disputes, border stories. We'll leave it at that. But there's a lot of things in your life that has changed, such as the fact that nobody really uses fax machines anymore, except for, I think, lenders, banks, stuff like that. What other changes have you seen in your life that were, I guess some things were so ubiquitous at a time, and today almost lost and forgotten?
Well, I will say right off, very few people use paper and pencil when they're out covering a story. They'll have all sorts of, 21st century wizardry in their phone, and the phone is no longer a phone. The phone is a traveling computer, and there are, without a doubt, some advantages to that. But it's always seemed to me the fewer electronic goods that you have with you, the better your story will be. It's as simple as that.
It's interesting. That pokes a dart right at me, because I always carry so much stuff, and I do feel sometimes it does interfere, because because let's face it, technology is fallible. Something's gonna go wrong, and then I get obsessed with trying to figure it out, and then that, of course, takes the focus away from maybe that story.
Do you find that people respond differently depending on how much electronic stuff you have with you?
Yeah, definitely not. Right. I mean, I carry a camera. One of the things I try to do, and I know you do this too, is for me, before anything, is to find a connection. That's not just say journalist, writer to another person, or as you would say, this is not an exploitation. If I take a photograph of somebody that may be totally different culturally, socioeconomically, and racially from me, before I even lift up the camera, I talk to them, and even if I don't know their language, I try to have at least a few words of that to establish we're all human, right? We're all human, and
indeed.
So I do that, but I think that I was in Monemvasia in Greece, and there's this. It's a beautiful Byzantine walled city that juts out on a narrow peninsula. No cars can get in there. And I was there, and I was more fascinated with the architecture, if you will, of the space. And I pulled out. I had a little drone, right? Talk about modern electronics. So here I am. I got a friggin' drone. That's because I make videos and things. But anyway, so I want to fly this drone. That did. All of a sudden, I got attracted. All these people curious about my drone. But what was scary for me, because I had it might have been one of my earliest flights with this, $1,000 piece of flying apparatus. And next thing I know, people are coming up to me asking questions, and I'm just trying to figure out. I don't want to lose this thing, have it crash into the Adriatic, wherever it was, not the Adriatic, but the Mediterranean there. And so that kind of reaction is not the one I wanted.
No.
Yeah,
there's something to be said for certain electronic gizmos, but I try not to say those things out loud.
Yeah, they're definitely. I agree with that. I saw an interview with one of your peers, Paul Theroux, who also was, a Peace Corps guy in the early days. And I saw an interview with him, and he said that he wrote his latest book, and I forget which one that was, and he wrote it all on legal pads. He did not use an electronic computer or anything. And I thought that, man.
I believe that was a book about Mexico.
Yeah, I think you're right. And can you imagine? I mean, do you? So how did about when you? Where was I? Did you? And I better let me bring myself into the image again. Where was I? Did you write this analog, or did you use electronics?
I wrote it on a computer.
Yeah,
I wrote it on a computer. Frankly, the Parkinson's has made my writing utterly illegible. There's a symptom called micrographia. Perhaps your stepdad had it. It means as you grow older, your handwriting gets more and more illegible and smaller and smaller. And I had micrographia. I simply could not write anything and read it 5 minutes later. So the best I could do was, at the end of the day, look in my notebook, see if I'd written down a word or two, and then write out my notes as best I could.
Yeah. He did have that. I didn't know what it was called, but he certainly had. And he, as I mentioned earlier in this, he, like you, was obsessive about notes. And yeah, I think the real good writers are that way.
One thing I could catch you on is the word is saguaro, pronounced with a W, not a G.
Oh, there you go. Saguaro, of course.
Saguaro, yes.
Yeah.
Then there was the what was the name of that group? There was a group, a country music group that did a song about this fallen saguaro that I wrote about.
Oh yeah, I remember that. But those cacti are ominous.
They are. They grow for 100 years, 150-year-old cactus.
And was that where you were towards the end of the book? You and your wife are taking a leisurely afternoon stroll through a national park or state park there, and
You're right. National Park, the Saguaro National Park. That's not where this particular incident took place, but yes, we were walking through there and got lost. As simple as that. We got lost, and we had no means of recovery until it was already dark, and we were resigned to the fact that we were going to spend the night there on the ground in this national park. Way off in the distance, we could hear somebody yelling, "Hello, hello," and we could see a little bit of a blue and yellow and red light flashing. Turns out it was the national park guide who was making the last sweep through the area to make sure nobody was left out in the dark. And in fact, we were the ones who, we were the ones who were left out in the dark, and he rescued us.
Yeah, it's an incredible story, because you could sense as you describe it in the book that there was tension, but then there was the attempt to not show tension.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I will share with this, Terry Gilliam, who also is obsessed with trying to make a movie out of out of Don Quixote, and I don't know how many attempts. I didn't know you mentioned in the book that he actually, I think, did make a movie, maybe more like a doc, about the fact that he's had no success in fully bringing this story of Cervantes to life, to the big screen.
That's right. So many people have tried it. They've made cartoons out of it. It's very popular depending on what country you're in. There was a story in yesterday's New York Times about the Indian language of Quechua. I've seen Quechua versions of Don Quixote. There's probably more translations of Don Quixote than the Bible.
And you mentioned that a very famous Spanish playwright who had much more notoriety in his time than Cervantes ever did, but nowadays nobody remembers him.
Nobody remembers. Now I'm forgetting him already.
Yeah, see, exactly.
What's his name? Well, it'll come back to me. It'll come back.
Yeah. One thing, as a writer, and I detect this, and again, having kind of getting reintroduced to you.
The Austin Lounge Lizards.
Which one?
The Austin Lounge Lizards.
Austin
Did a
Lounge.
recording called Saguaro, and Saguaro was about this incident where a fellow drunken fool went out into the desert one day with his shotgun and his friend, and his goal was to shoot as many saguaro as he could. There's one saguaro that wouldn't fall down. Most of them fell down after he shot them, but there's one that wouldn't fall down. He went over to it, picked up a saguaro rib off the ground that had fallen down, poked the arm of the saguaro, it fell down on it and killed him.
In a chaotic episode, the cactus killed him. So, touche, I guess we could say in that. That's a great. I have to dig up that song. That sounds like
the Austin Lounge Lizards.
Austin Lounge.
It's on an album called. Saguaro from the Black Saloon. I don't know. We'll find it.
We'll find it. Yeah. One, there's two things as we go. There was a very famous a trial there of farmers who had. You can tell the story. It was in your backyard there in Arizona. Mexicans were killed, and the people were acquitted of this tragic torture.
There was a rancher and his two sons who owned property right along the Mexican border. They were just west of Douglas, Arizona. And one day, this is 1976. One day, there were three campesinos from Mexico who were crossing, going to work in the fields. And instead of letting them by, or instead of sending them back to Mexico, they kidnapped them. They tortured them. They took their clothes off. They burned the heels of their feet. They were strung them up on as if to hang them. For about a half hour, they just tortured these three Mexicans. Finally, stripped naked, they sent them back into Mexico, firing buckshot into their back. These three guys normally would have been killed under the circumstance, but they remember exactly where it happened and who did it and what was the circumstance. So this became a trial in Cochise County Superior Court in 1977. It was one of the great trials that's unknown in the larger context of the border, but probably more than anything, it tells the whole story.
Yeah, reading that, it just brought anger to me. I mean, it was just incredible. A feeling that third country has a lot of stories that sometimes aren't told. Yeah, there's a lot of tongue in cheek and fun wordplay in your writing. In this book, you reveal it in a couple places. I mean, first, I love the fact and I've been to South Africa, and you talk about the potjie and how that is actually got 3 meanings. And maybe you want to share what the potjie is.
You're familiar with it, I take it.
Oh, yes.
Very good. Potjie is a word. It sounds like Porky Pig, but it's just it's a word that comes from the Afrikaan language, and it could be an event, it can be a type of food, or it can be just a circumstance. And you can say, "Come on over to my house. We'll have a potjie and serve some potjie."
I love that. And then in towards the end of the book, you go on about your realization that you're going to have to use to move around due to the Parkinson's a walker. But you go on, and maybe I can find it. I didn't write the page number here, but I loved the many words like potjie, the walker. Talk us about how you play with words like that, because that was total wordplay. It was really fun.
Oh, absolutely total wordplay. Walkers, I have the Fats Domino Walker trilogy, for example. I'm walking, yes, indeed, and I'm talking about you and me. That's the Fats Domino. I'm walking to New Orleans, and I want to walk you home. The Fats Domino Walker trilogy. I don't know why he named it like that. Just leave it to me.
Leave it to you to uncover it and actually give it the proper title.
Exactly. There was a country music song by Sleep at the Wheel called "The Letter That Johnny Walker Read." Well, there's another use of walker. There's walkers all over the place, and it's one that I use every day. In fact, it's right next to me at this moment.
I really appreciate you taking so much time with me today, and there's so many areas we didn't get. We didn't talk about Morris Thompson. We didn't talk about Ry Cooder, the Buena Vista Social Club, but all of these stories in Tom's fantastic long career as woven in, as you mentioned, that they all have a string. They're all connected. They're all part of a large tapestry that come out in Where Was I? And I guess the very last thing you could say, I'll leave you to kind of end this interview. I'd love you just to kind of sum up why the title Where Was I? And is there something else I should have asked you?
The 1605 edition of Don Quixote.
Ah, yeah.
This is a book that was written in the beginning of the 17th century, and there might have been about close to 30 copies that are left in the world. Most of them are in museums and such, but there was one copy in private hands, a fellow in the town of Toledo, Spain, and he allowed me to come up to his private library, and the word fondle would be appropriate, and fondle to the 1605 edition, the first printing of Don Quixote.
Which is unbelievable. And I remember you say they didn't even ask you to wear gloves or, and they were, you were curious about humidity and controlling that. And it's pretty much like just sitting on a shelf in his house. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
The first edition of Don Quixote, 1605. How were they? And you talk about the pages. That would be really interesting, because I don't think anybody on this podcast has ever maybe even held a book that was 200 years old. But the paper was an interesting feel for you, right?
It was thick. It was thicker than most paper pages we're accustomed to. Lope de Vega is the Spanish writer whose name we forgot earlier.
Ah, there you go. That's right. Yeah. So easily forgotten, but yet,
right.
I was in Guanajuato, maybe 10 years ago.
Well, so is my T-shirt, if I can.
Oh, is that right? Guanajuato. So you've been to the Cervantes Festival, I imagine.
I have.
Yeah, that's awesome.
And you have too, I take it.
Yes, I have. Yeah, it's perhaps could be. I don't know. Everybody always asks me, "Where's your favorite country? Where's your favorite thing?" And I hesitate to say Guanajuato is maybe my favorite city in Mexico, but it's certainly. I love the whole colonial, the Sierra Madre. That more than the playas. That to me is the deep into Mexico. So where was I?
Right. You know that Hank Snow record, I've Been Everywhere, Man.
Oh, yeah.
Across the desert, where, man. I can't say I've been everywhere. That's pushing it. But I will say that when I first come to a city and I get off a bus or get off a plane even, I spend the first few minutes looking around saying, could I move here? Why do people live here? What is this place all about? And after 5 minutes, I said, well, okay, that takes care of that. I've decided not to move here, but I'll write about it. Except for one, that's taken place in Guanajuato, as you described, in Cuenca, Ecuador, in Bisbee, Arizona. And yet when I went to San Sebastian in the northwest of Spain in the Basque country, after 5 minutes there, I said, you know what? I could pack up and move here if it came to that. I could pack up and move here. So that's where I was, but I was in all of those places and none of the places all at once.
I love it. San Sebastian. I have not been to the Basque. It's on my list, I guess. Yeah, for sure. I hear the food is outstanding as well.
It is. Oh. It's expensive, but it's outstanding.
I will show you one thing before you go.
Sure.
And maybe I'll send this to you, although I don't want the critique. This is my book, Forks. And it's more of a coffee table book. Okay. So this is probably more like 35 magazine articles.
Okay.
35 different countries.
Mm-hmm.
But what I did in this, I decided that I couldn't just write a, so to speak, memoir or a travel log about my trip. I went around the world on my motorcycle for 3 years and all through South America. So I thought the real way to bring light is to focus on the people. So there's stories about people that I encountered mostly. Mm-hmm. And then there's a lot of photographs because, as you know, I carry that camera. Then it's about the food. What I did is I decided that in each chapter, which represents a country, one country per one chapter is a country, and South Africa gets a chapter. And at the end of every chapter, there's a recipe, usually like a national,
very nice,
a national dish, because it's all about where we connect with each other is over food.
There's the continuity.
Yes, there's the poiki. So you can't really see the legs. Well, down in that little one, you can see there's a and then of course there's the recipe. And I talk about up here what the poiki is. I wish I used that device to talk about a poiki. It's like a barbecue. We kind of do, or asado, right?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
It has that similarity.
Yeah. Hey, my guest has been Tom Miller, the legendary travel writer whose latest book is a memoir, Where Was I? Has been my guest here, calling in from, are you in Bisbee?
I'm in Tucson.
Tucson, Arizona, where at the U of A right there are archived the notes for one of his most popular books, The Panama Hat Trail. I'm going to put links to all of Tom's stuff, his website. It's at tommillerbooks.com. You'll see it in the podcast description. I really enjoyed the time, Tom.
Oh,
thanks.
That's great.
Yeah. We'll have to do that again.
I'm so glad you invited me.
Yeah, no, this has been fantastic and my honor. So thank you. Thank you so much.
You're quite welcome.
I wish you luck with the book.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Well, thank you again for inviting me.
Well, thanks for taking so much time. And I know we took a little longer, but I think there's really good stuff and the listeners are going to love this.
Okay.
All right.
Take it easy.
Enjoy. Bye.